They never expected it. In halls where words are usually polished, softened, and carefully weighed, a voice from India shattered the silence with a remark that carried the weight of 1 billion people. It wasn't diplomacy as usual, it was a moment of truth, spoken without apology, and it left Americans stunned. India's bold voice on global platforms is not just a shift in tone, it is a declaration of intent that the era of playing second fiddle in international affairs is over. For decades, India was often seen as a balancing force, carefully choosing its words in global summits, avoiding confrontations, and treading the path of non-alignment with extreme caution. But what Jaishankar's recent remark has revealed is a radical change in posture, one that is unapologetic, assertive, and reflective of a nation that knows its weight in the 21st century. His words did not come across as rehearsed diplomatic niceties designed to please both sides. They were precise, sharp, and unafraid to call out hypocrisy where it exists. This is the new Indian voice that the world must now adapt to, one that does not dilute its message to accommodate sensitivities of the powerful. The boldness is not arrogance, it is confidence, born from decades of economic growth, military modernization, and the rise of a self-assured society that no longer tolerates being spoken down to. When Jaishankar speaks on international stages today, his words carry the authority of representing over 1 billion people whose aspirations and sacrifices have earned them the right to shape global discourse. This is not the language of a dependent state seeking validation from the West. This is the language of a nation that views itself as a stakeholder in building the rules of tomorrow. The striking part of this bold voice is its balance of truth and diplomacy. It is not reckless outburst, it is calculated firmness that resonates far beyond conference halls. When he draws lines on sovereignty, security, or fairness, he is not just making a point to foreign audiences. He is signaling to the Indian people that their leadership is prepared to defend their dignity in every forum. The bold voice echoes the transformation of India's image from a recipient of global charity to a provider of solutions, from being a silent observer to a decisive player, from being hesitant to being fearless. This shift has stunned many in the West because it overturns decades of assumptions about India's place in the global hierarchy, and it sets the stage for how the future of international relations will be negotiated. The shockwave in American circles following Jaishankar's latest remark was not simply about the content of his words, it was about the manner in which they were delivered and the confidence that stood behind them. For years, the diplomatic relationship between India and the United States has been shaped by calculated politeness, veiled criticism, and backroom negotiations where tensions were managed but rarely expressed openly. What startled American commentators was the sheer bluntness of Jaishankar's statement. It was not dressed in the usual soft language of diplomacy. It was spoken with a directness that challenged the carefully maintained comfort zone of US officials. When an Indian minister looks across the table and says what the West has avoided hearing for years, it carries an entirely different weight. This is why analysts, journalists, and policymakers in Washington suddenly found themselves discussing not just the remark itself, but what it symbolizes about the India of today. They are unaccustomed to being addressed in a tone that suggests equality rather than deference, and this is precisely what has left many stunned. What added to the intensity of the reaction is the way the statement echoed through American media outlets. Debates were sparked about whether India is moving into a more confrontational phase of diplomacy or whether it is simply exercising the confidence that comes with its rising global status. Commentators pointed out that such frankness is rare from leaders outside the Western Bloc, especially when addressing the United States directly. Yet Jaishankar's delivery was calm, measured, and completely unyielding, as though he was not trying to win approval but to set the record straight. That quality of conviction struck a nerve because it disrupts a long-standing habit of Western policymakers to assume that nations like India will always temper their words for fear of straining ties. Instead, what they encountered was an Indian voice that refused to bend, a tone that reflected national self-respect, and a message that declared India will not accept double standards without calling them out. In the corridors of Washington, this triggered discomfort and admiration simultaneously. Some viewed it as a wake-up call that America can no longer take India's alignment for granted, while others worried it might represent the first steps toward a more unpredictable global order. The shock, then, is not temporary. It is a realization that the world has changed, that India no longer speaks from the margins, and that its leaders now carry the power to unsettle established narratives with a single, unflinching remark. The phrase, "beyond all limits," does not stand as a casual expression, but as a carefully chosen declaration that reflects a point of exhaustion with the way India has been treated in global discourse. For too long, Western powers have operated under the assumption that their criticisms, demands, and judgments could stretch indefinitely, expecting nations like India to either quietly comply or offer diluted responses. By using a phrase that draws a line in the sand, Jaishankar made it clear that there are thresholds which, once crossed, will be met with resistance rather than silence. This is what makes the remark powerful. It is not simply an objection to one specific issue, but a symbolic rejection of the idea that India can be pushed indefinitely without consequence. It redefines the boundaries of global debate by warning that there are points where tolerance ends and direct confrontation begins. In essence, the phrase is a demand for fairness. It is India saying that international relationships must be built on mutual respect rather than unequal expectations. When Jaishankar speaks of something going beyond all limits, he is not only addressing a single political or diplomatic disagreement, he is addressing a pattern where the West assumes it has the authority to dictate how India must act, align, or respond. That assumption has now been directly challenged, and the choice of words conveys a message that India will not allow itself to be boxed into corners that compromise its dignity. What makes this even more striking is that such language is often avoided in diplomacy because it carries the risk of escalation. Yet here the calculated risk was taken, knowing well that it would provoke discussion and possibly discomfort in powerful circles. The reaction to this phrase reveals why it matters. It sent ripples across commentary platforms where observers tried to parse its meaning and consequences. Some saw it as India breaking free from decades of restraint, while others viewed it as a warning shot in a larger struggle over influence in the global south. What is undeniable is that it reframes the way India is perceived. Instead of being seen as a cautious, consensus-seeking nation, India now appears as a country willing to articulate its boundaries with absolute clarity. Beyond all limits, therefore, is more than rhetoric. It is a declaration that the future of diplomacy with India will not be one-sided, and that pushing too far will meet a firm and public response. It is this unambiguous redefinition of discourse that startled many and set the stage for a new chapter in international relations where India insists on drawing its own lines. India's rising global stature is the foundation upon which Jaishankar's uncompromising words gain their weight, because without the power and influence that the country now wields, such statements would risk being dismissed as symbolic rhetoric. Over the last 2 decades, India has transformed itself from a developing nation that was often treated as a secondary player into a key power whose participation is now indispensable in solving global challenges. Its economic growth has been steady and resilient, placing it among the fastest-growing major economies in the world. With a young population, thriving innovation ecosystem, and expanding technological base, India is increasingly recognized not only as a consumer market, but as a generator of solutions that impact the global economy. This new identity provides its diplomats with the authority to speak with a tone that reflects confidence rather than caution. Jaishankar's words are therefore not simply personal expressions, but the voice of a nation that has earned the legitimacy to confront global powers on matters of fairness and respect. On the strategic front, India's defence modernisation and expanding military partnerships have further reinforced its position as a global force. No longer reliant solely on external powers for security, India has built indigenous capabilities while simultaneously deepening ties with multiple partners across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Its role in the Indo-Pacific has made it a pivotal actor in balancing power equations, and this shift has not gone unnoticed in Washington or Beijing. When Jaishankar speaks sharply, it carries the implicit reminder that India is not merely a participant in international affairs, but an essential stakeholder whose cooperation or resistance can shape outcomes. This leverage makes his words resonate more powerfully than they might have in the past. Culturally and politically as well, India's democratic model gives it a unique voice. It represents not only its own population of over 1 billion, but also resonates with other developing nations seeking fairness in a system often skewed toward the interests of the West. As India's global image evolves from that of a cautious voice to that of a leader willing to set terms, Jaishankar's statements serve as both a reflection of national pride and a projection of power. The astonishment in American circles stems from the realization that India now has the capacity to not only reject narratives imposed upon it, but also to influence the narratives of others. This is why his remark carried such force. It was underpinned by the undeniable fact that India's stature today allows it to speak boldly, and when it does, the world listens with attention rather than condescension. The new tone of Indian diplomacy is perhaps the most defining feature of Jaishankar's interventions on the world stage, because it departs sharply from the careful, almost hesitant style that had characterized India's foreign policy in previous decades. Where Indian representatives once leaned heavily on non-alignment and moderation, today the language is sharper, direct, and unafraid of confrontation when necessary. This does not mean it is reckless, but rather that it reflects a newfound confidence rooted in India's growth, stability, and rising influence. Jaishankar embodies this tone by speaking in a manner that does not seek to appease audiences abroad, but instead asserts India's priorities clearly, even if that unsettles long-standing partners. His remarks are delivered with composure, but the underlying firmness signals that India has moved away from the era of defensive explanations. Instead, it now adopts a proactive approach that frames its choices as sovereign, legitimate, and non-negotiable. This tonal shift has been striking to both allies and critics, who are accustomed to Indian diplomacy being softer, more ambiguous, and often too careful to offend. Part of what makes this new style significant is how it appeals to multiple audiences simultaneously. Internationally, it forces global powers to take India seriously, not as a junior partner, but as a nation that can push back when confronted with double standards. Domestically, it reinforces the pride of citizens who want to see their leaders standing tall and speaking without hesitation in defense of national interests. Every time Jaishankar delivers a statement that cuts through diplomatic niceties, it resonates with ordinary Indians who feel their voice is finally being represented with courage. This dual impact strengthens India's position because it allows the government to build credibility at home while expanding respect abroad. It also changes the way negotiations are conducted, as foreign leaders now know they cannot assume quiet compliance or endless patience from New Delhi. What adds weight to this tone is its consistency. It is not a one-off strategy used in moments of tension, but a deliberate and sustained approach that has come to define India's global posture. Whether addressing issues of sovereignty, trade, or geopolitics, the tone remains steady, clear, unapologetic, and rooted in self-respect. This signals a long-term transformation in Indian diplomacy, where strength and clarity take precedence over caution and compromise. The world is slowly adjusting to this change, but for many in the West, It remains startling to hear such firmness from a country they once assumed would always tread carefully. It marks a shift in perception and power, ensuring that India's words are not just heard, but also remembered. The beginning of a global power realignment is the larger context in which Jaishankar's remark must be understood, because it is not just about one sharp statement, but about the shifting structure of international politics. For decades, the United States and its Western allies dominated the global order, dictating narratives, setting rules, and expecting compliance from other nations. That dominance is now being challenged by the rise of multiple centers of power, and India has positioned itself as one of the key players in this transformation. Jaishankar's bluntness reflects not only India's own confidence, but also the reality that the world is entering an era of multipolarity, where no single country can claim absolute authority. The astonishment in American circles comes from realizing that India, a nation once treated as a junior partner, now speaks with a voice strong enough to disrupt long-established patterns. His words signal to the world that New Delhi is ready to stand as an independent pole in this emerging order, not as an extension of Western influence. This realignment is already visible in how India balances its global relationships. It maintains strategic ties with Washington while refusing to sever connections with Moscow. It deepens partnerships in Asia, Africa, and Latin America while preserving its autonomy in decision-making. Such an approach demonstrates that India does not see itself as bound to any single bloc, but instead as a power capable of maneuvering across multiple alliances to serve its own interests. This independence has unsettled many in the West, who are used to countries aligning more predictably with their agendas. When Jaishankar's remark challenged American assumptions, it underscored that the age of unquestioned Western dominance is fading, replaced by a system where voices like India's cannot be ignored or overridden. The implications of this realignment go far beyond diplomacy. It reshapes global trade, security, and governance structures. By asserting its voice so forcefully, India inspires other nations in the global south to also demand fairness and equality in international institutions. It becomes a model for how middle powers can rise without surrendering their independence. The fact that American commentators were stunned reflects how deeply this moment cut into the old narrative of US leadership being unchallenged. The future will be defined by cooperation, competition, and negotiation among multiple rising powers, and India's willingness to speak beyond all limits shows it is ready to play a central role. This is not a passing phase, but the beginning of a permanent shift. And Jaishankar's words crystallize the reality that global power equations are no longer static but in motion, with India at the heart of the transformation. This is what the world must now understand. India no longer speaks in whispers, nor does it wait for validation from distant capitals. It speaks with clarity, with conviction, and with the authority of a nation that has earned its place at the center of global power. Beyond all limits was not just a phrase. It was a declaration that the age of unquestioned dominance is over, and a new era of equality has begun. America was stunned, but history will remember that India's voice, strong and unflinching, marked the turning point in how the world's future will be written.